Hey everybody, as you may know, when I'm not driving race cars, I do enjoy working on cars. So today, I'm going to show you a tutorial on how to change the manual transmission fluid, or the transaxle fluid, as it's the transmission and the differential fluid, on my Volvo C30. So the first step in the process is we want to jack up the car and make sure it's perfectly level. As you can see, got my little level here, and we are absolutely nice and flat. It's important, obviously, because the fill plug is on the side of the transmission, so we want to ensure we have the correct fluid amount. Now, the next step you'll see is we do need to remove the left front wheel, which is why I have a floor jack right there. All right, so I've got my 19mm socket and my locking lug nut, and now let's go take off the wheel. All right, so now with the wheel off, let's take a look at where our fill plug is obviously we want to remove that before the drain plug, because if we can't get this off, drain the transmission fluid, well, we're screwed. So as you might see behind the CV boot here on the axle, there is our fill plug. It's a bit of a strange location, as part of the subframe here actually ends up blocking it. So accessing it is not the easiest in the world, hence why we have to take off the wheel. But before we do that, we do need to take off the lower pan that protects the oil pan in the transmission, so we can have better access for when we drain the fluid, obviously. Another quick safety tip I always recommend when you're using a floor jack is always have a jack stand or put your wheel under the car, as in case your floor jack does start losing pressure, you want to make sure there's something to hold up the car if you are underneath it. Always important to prioritize safety whenever you're under a car. So we now have the floor pan out of the car, and most Volvos we use a T25 like this one here, which I can't seem to get the camera to focus on. My car, bit strange being a high mileage hero, it's got a mix of Phillips head, zip ties, and one T25 like this, as obviously this car's had quite a bit of a life. Now when changing the transmission fluid, I do recommend doing this when it's cold, a bit opposite to when you're doing engine oil. And the reason for that is when you fill it up, you want to make sure that you can get the most amount of fluid in there, obviously at the proper level. And of course, when the fluid is cold, it hasn't expanded as much, and therefore it will have a greater filling capacity. It's not too much of a difference. We're talking probably less than 1/10 of a liter, but obviously a little bit more just helps. So now we are at the hardest part of the process, which is accessing the fill plug. So I'm going to show you my little contraption to how we're going to do this. So the tool we will need is a 24mm socket. One thing to note, Volvo does make their own special tool for the fill plug on the transmission, but you don't need it to do this job. I then have a 1/2" drive to 3/8 adapter because I have a 1/2" drive socket with a 3/8 drive ratchet. And then the most important part is this little swivelly head. This is going to be important because it'll allow us to get around that bar on the subframe, and therefore our 6-inch extension can attach to our ratchet and we can pop the fill plug loose. So regarding my last point on the tools to actually remove the fill plug, I've done it a bit differently. As you can see, I've taken off the little swivel head, just gone with the 24mm socket and the ratchet. But here's the important part, this pry bar. Now the reason for this is, unless you have a super narrow 24mm socket, it is an absolute pain to get the socket to fit behind this arm on the subframe and obviously around the bolt for the fill plug. So what I ended up doing was taking the pry bar and pushing the pry bar between the arm on the subframe here and this little ledge on the transmission, which obviously will then push the transmission forward and get me just that tiny bit more access. With that little bit more of access, I could get the socket around the bolt and then pop it loose. All right, now that we have our fill plug off, we've made it to the fun part, the drain plug. Drain plug is actually super easy to reach on this car, unlike the fill plug. And if you look right up there, there is our drain plug. Same as the fill plug, 24mm socket, pop it loose, and we'll see our fluid drain out. All right, and here's the fun part, draining the transmission fluid. Slowly loosen this, make sure my catch pan below doesn't not cover where the fluid will drain into. So obviously that would make a mess. And voila, our fluid comes out. Now, if you are wondering why my fluid is such a gray color, that is because we are using the Liqui Moly MOS2 anti-friction for gears additive. That additive is a gray color due to the molybdenum disulfide, hence why it looks like my transmission is quite dark in fluid, but that is the natural fluid color, so not to be freaked out thinking you've blown a transmission. So the transmission itself holds about 2 liters of fluid, so it's actually not too much. So we'll just let it drain out here. Something you could do, but you don't have to do, is slightly adjust the level of the car. If you want to try to lean it to allow more fluid to drain out. Doesn't really make a difference in my opinion. If they put the drain plug here from the factory, there's a reason. They probably assumed it's going to be enough fluid to drain out. So I'm just going to let it drain out before we put the new drain plug back in. Okay, so we have our drain plug all cleaned off and our new crush washer installed. So now let's go install it back on the car. Torque spec for these plugs, both the drain and the fill plug, is 35 Newton meters. Now, an easy trick if you do want to inspect the health of your transmission is to take a look at the fluid with a magnet and see how much metal particulate ends up picking up on the magnet. So in this case, I will run my magnet through, kind of circling around, and it's bizarre. And as we can see on our magnet here, we have pretty much nothing. So fantastic. That's what we want to see. So for filling our transmission fluid, I recommend getting a little pump or siphon like this, where you can extract fluid from the bottle and then pump it directly into the transmission. It's pretty much impossible on a sideways drain plug to pour fluid in there, so this is definitely the easiest method by far. Now, the way I always like adding in the Liqui Moly MOS2 additive for gears is first to put in a liter of transmission fluid, then put in our additive. You squeeze it like a toothpaste tube, and then finally keep adding fluid until it starts coming out of the fill plug. Then you know you have enough fluid in your car. Of course, make sure it's level. So as you may be able to see, we now have some transmission fluid dripping out, and that means we have reached the appropriate fill level. So now we're going to put our fill plug back on, and I recommend using the pry bar once again to get some better leverage. Start threading it by hand, and then when you can with the pry bar, get the socket around and torque it to 35 Newton meters. So now that our fill plug is on and torqued, our next step is going to be to put our under tray back on, and then put on our wheel, and then of course start up the car and make sure it goes through all the gears nice and smoothly. So now with our car running, we'll go through all the gears, make sure it feels nice and smooth, and it feels absolutely buttery and fantastic, which is exactly what we wanted. You might notice on the first shift there might be a little clunk, because obviously the fluid just needs to spread around, but once you move it around, the shift forks will slide around the fluid and it should feel nice and buttery. And of course, once you're driving the car and it gets to its operating temperature, it'll be just that bit better. So there you go. That's how you do the transmission fluid on a Volvo C30. Not the easiest process, but definitely not the hardest. So once again, hope you guys enjoyed this video, seeing a little bit behind the scenes of some of my passion projects, which include working on cars. Let me know if you want to see more tutorials like this with the rest of the Stiglette fleet. Thank you guys for watching. Please subscribe. See you next time.